Hello, I'm Steven Roy Goodman, host of Higher Education Today, a production of the University of the District of Columbia. Welcome back to the education program that connects you to contemporary issues, people, and institutions involved in the world of higher education. Today we'll be talking about digital badges. Daniel Hickey is an associate professor in the Learning Sciences program at Indiana University. He focuses on participatory approaches to assessment and motivation, including digital badges. Dan has co-authored dozens of articles about learning and education. Welcome.
Thank you, Steve. Happy to be here. It's an honor and a pleasure.
Well, thank you for coming on. Well, maybe if we could start, Dan, what are digital badges?
Well, badges are tokens of accomplishment or learning. Digital badges are web-enabled tokens of accomplishment. So what that means is that they can contain claims and evidence. A traditional badge on a sash or on a uniform or something, it takes its value from the institution that gave it or that's associated with it. Digital badges, on the other hand, because they're web-enabled, literally can be shared in social networks. When someone clicks on them, they open up, and they can contain whatever claims about learning or accomplishment that the issuer chose to put in them, and can have links to evidence supporting those claims. That's kind of different.
Well, let's say Indiana University. Does Indiana University use these digital badges?
In fact, we just met last week to discuss it, where there's two things going on. One is we've launched a big initiative in online learning, and they're going to use them to recognize faculty accomplishment. So that's going to be our first foray into it. We'll be using a system that Purdue University actually developed called Passport. So that'll be the very first official use. I used them in a thing that I offered last fall. I called it a BOOC, not a MOOC, but a BOOC, a big open online course. So I had several hundred people, and I used badges to, so for instance, if a teacher completed my course and wanted to claim professional development hours, and wanted to claim more than, say, the 30 hours that it said on the certificate because they did a lot more, they could email the badges that they earned to their supervisor, and that badge contained all the evidence of all the work that they did. Several of our teachers used them to say, look, I did all this work.
But somebody still has to recognize the work or not recognize the work.
Yes.
Well, let's get to your university or Purdue, either one. So if I'm a student at Indiana University or Purdue University and I take a class, I'm rewarded if I study and I do well in that class. I get an A or a B or whatever I get. But my understanding is that now I got credit for a certain number of hours of classroom instruction as opposed to what I really learned.
Yeah. So most of the uses so far have really been in much more informal settings. Most of the university settings have been for so-called co-curricular outcomes. Because there already is this sophisticated century-old grades, credentials, transcripts. So badges may or may not replace that system. In many respects, they supplement it. But really what they're best at, right now anyways, is recognizing things that don't work within that traditional system.
And what would be an example of that? Would it be a skill that I've developed that I learned how to sing or something like that?
Well, much of this movement comes from the 2012 Badges for Lifelong Learning competition that the MacArthur Foundation sponsored. So they awarded funds to 30 very diverse projects to develop these open digital badges, ranging from the Girl Scouts to the Providence After School Alliance, an organization that makes it possible for students in Providence to gain credit for things that they do after school and after school programs. Some of those badges their teachers will actually accept for credit. So that's a good example of the kinds of things that have been happening over the last 2 years.
Do other countries do anything like this?
There's a lot of interest from overseas. We just recently, there was a big event in Silicon Valley just a couple of months ago that kicked off the Badge Alliance, which is a big umbrella organization with partners. So for example, the Educational Ministry of Qatar was involved in that. They see the potential. So there's pockets of interest around. I get contacted by quite a few people from around the world asking for information, asking for help, asking if we want to come and we can have people come and present or help out with it. So there's definitely a lot of interest in it.
Well, but let's get back to this issue of the credit hour versus what you're actually learning, because I think this would be interesting, particularly in rural areas around the United States. So let's assume I live 200 miles away from a major research university, it might make sense for me to do more of my work online and then get some sort of credit or recognition for that work.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing that a lot of people are starting to look at, a lot of vocational programs in particular. But what they're really interested in is the more fine-grained evidence that the badges contain. So it's not just a grade, it's not just the credit hours, but it's much more specific about what competencies people actually have. And that's a big transformation for them.
So yeah, and you're saying that's beyond the transcript then?
Yes, yeah.
So let's play that out a little bit, because that's kind of interesting, because let's say an employer gets a transcript, all they get is a piece of paper that says that Johnny or Sally got a certain grade on a certain final, and that's that. You're saying what an employer now can do is click on it and find out how much a student actually knows about a particular topic.
If the person who issued that badge did their homework and really thought deeply about what claims they were going to make and what evidence, what assessment evidence they were going to marshal to support it. So it really does depend. It's wide open, and it's really up to what the person who issues the badge chooses to put in it that ends up making that badge valuable. So right now we're in a bit of a chicken and egg problem, and that's playing out now, but given the developments over the last year, certainly many employers and many college admissions officers are really starting to take notice, and I would suspect that I'd say within a year, especially when right now there's an issue around the verification, because the Mozilla Foundation, who's really provided this sort of the network, really the guts of the thing, really deliberately have kept it quite open. In other words, it's not locked down right now the way that the credentials are. So I think once that is solved within the next year or so, then in fact I think we'll see much more of that, because it will be possible to have a truly official, verified, bulletproof badge that you absolutely know where it came from.
But I wonder if it's a non-university could do this.
Absolutely.
Why couldn't a private company do that?
They are. It's actually being a little slower probably to be taken up. Where it's really happening is a lot of informal after-school programs. The universities are just beginning to move into it. For instance, at my university, the Asian Student Association is a 3,000 student association. Well, the person who runs that is really running a medium-sized organization, and there's really it's not easy for them to represent that kind of the so-called co-curricular learning outcomes. And a lot of universities are really interested because they're under a lot of pressure right now to demonstrate their value added, because residential college is so expensive. There's enormous political pressure to move it all to online and move it all to community colleges. So that's another example of where people are seeing a lot of value in this approach.
But let's take the issue of languages. So how would I know the competency that a language, how competent you are in a particular language? I could give you a test, I guess.
Yeah, I would say, that's an area where I wouldn't imagine. I don't think badges are going to supplant something like the TESOL, or the teaching of the test, whichever the language test is. I don't think we'll see much change there. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. That'll still be official, maybe, but that doesn't really take advantage. If you just open up the badge and all it contains is a score, that really isn't any different. That's a very different thing than opening up a badge and having a paper someone wrote and comments from classmates or peers on that paper from a social network.
Well, let's get to the issue of that paper. So let's assume 5 years out, I go to the University of X, Y, or Z, I get a badge that says that I'm really great at history from XYZ place, and we click on the button and it shows my papers, which is great.
Yes.
But what happens if I'm 5 or 10 years out and now all of a sudden that paper doesn't seem quite as sophisticated as it seemed when I wrote it?
Well, that raises a really important issue about so-called open digital badges. Open refers to the fact that this transparency that comes with it. A really key part about an open badge is that the earner controls how that badge is represented, what it contains. Right now you have this so-called backpack. The Mozilla Foundation has established this convention, the Mozilla Backpack. When you earn a badge, in an open badge that's consistent with the so-called open badge infrastructure, which is a metadata standard, you have the option of pushing that badge to your backpack. The really important thing is that once it's in your backpack, you control how it's displayed and how it's curated. You get to add more information, and people don't quite realize until they see that happening what it means when you get to say, I earned this badge for doing this, or I'm going to put all of my badges that represent these skills in this folder, and I'm going to make it public. So if you don't value that badge down the future, or you got more valuable ones, you just go in and remove it from that folder. So that's the important thing about the open badges, is this control, right? If you get bad grades at a university, right? If you got an F, but you have a transcript, you have no control over that. That whole transcript goes out. So this is a really different thing. It really does put the earner in control of how they represent those skills and their competencies.
That is interesting. I'm thinking, as you were saying that, I was thinking we did a segment a while ago about emergency medical services. And we had two people who actually do emergency medical services, which is a really hard job. But imagine if you were trying to get that job and you could say that I'm really good at stopping the bleeding, or I'm really good at some sort of emergency protocol. That would be a great thing for somebody who's trying to get a job, because somebody could click on that badge and see, well, here's what I accomplished in the last year or two in EMS service X or Y.
Yeah, although that raises a good point. That'd have to be a pretty bulletproof badge. We'd have to have a really elaborate verification system in place. And there are for-profit firms that are really seriously going after that with precisely that motivation. They see, I mean, the professional credentialing industry is an enormous and influential industry. A lot of people don't see it. It doesn't get as much visibility as the sort of universities and stuff, but there are credentialing in medicine in every field. So that's going to be a very interesting thing over the next few years. A lot of people predict because right now, very cumbersome mail-based, paper-based processes. If you want to be a nurse, get your credential as a nurse, you have to mail boxes and boxes and boxes of things, and people have to mail stuff to you. It's a very elaborate process. That's going to have to get with the 21st century somehow, someday, and there's a very good chance that badges will do that.
And what about people who claim that we're measuring information but not insight?
That gets right into the heart of my research. That to me is probably one of the most valuable things of all. Many, if not most of the people that are looking at badges recognize that's the kind of thing. Social networks are really good for recognizing insight. You know, when you're in these sort of what we would call an interest-driven social network, it becomes apparent pretty quickly who's really driving the conversation, who's influential. In a class, it becomes possible to. So as a cognitive psychologist, I like to think of those things as more practices than skills. And they're dispositions that you demonstrate, and they're very contextual. Well, badges have a potential of carrying that information in really new ways. So, for example, when I did my big open online course that Google sponsored in the fall, you earned 3 badges. You would get a badge for assessment practices, assessment principles, and assessment policies. And you'd earn that badge if you completed all 3 or 4 assignments and you completed the exam. Well, part of the class involved a peer promotion and a peer endorsement. You only had to have your work endorsed by your peers as being complete in order to earn the badge. But you also had the opportunity once a week to endorse one and only one of your classmates for being exemplary. So whoever in the networking groups in this open course got the most of those promotions, their version of the badge said leader on it. And if they chose to, when they issued that badge, when they pushed that badge out to social networks, they had the option of actually including what their classmates said about their work, and they had the option of including the work that they did. That's a very different kind of thing, and that's a very different kind of recognition. So many of the badging systems that are coming online are recognizing that sort of thing. That you really can't measure that kind of stuff, but you can recognize it.
But what about the recognition of a creative idea? You mentioned leadership, but what if there's a new idea that's controversial or that a lot of people don't necessarily see today, but that perhaps will carry the day tomorrow?
Gosh, I don't know whether that, I suspect that's probably beyond the sort of this kind of network. I could be wrong, but what'll be really interesting to see is, right, so you know the way that things go viral in social networks. Well, it's very possible that may start happening with badges. Certainly the credibility and the value of a badge will be constructed. So it seems possible that you know, if there's only one and only one in a broad organization, and it really becomes truly valued, if the organization has done a really good job of making sure that in that community that everybody recognizes that value, that badge really means something, that's a good example of the kind of thing, the many kinds of things that we think are going to happen. We don't know. It's changed, it's evolved dramatically, the badge movement. 2 or 3 years' time, it's hard to say what kind of things will happen, but that's a good example of the kind of thing that might.
And how would you interact with this concept with, let's say, edX or something like that?
Well, funny you should ask. edX is one of 30 organizations that recently signed on to this new organization. There was the Brain Trust at Mozilla Foundation, led by Aaron Knight, recently left Mozilla and started a new organization, this Badge Alliance. edX is one of a number of educational organizations that has committed to become part of this Badge Alliance, as has Blackboard, another major university. So, and edX is, as we speak, they're discussing installing this thing called Badge Kit that Mozilla has developed, and that will make it possible for anyone who's using at least Open edX, and I presume down the road the edX platform, to quite simply for the instructor to decide, I'm going to make these 4 or 5 badges available, and if everybody earns those badges, then they will earn this other one. So I would say within a year's time, we will see it widely taken up within both Blackboard and edX.
And what about the military? Is the military using any of this at all? No,
not yet. A couple of things involving the military that give you an idea of the breadth of interest, though. One is BadgeWorks for Vets is one of the 30 organizations that was funded by the Digital Media and Learning Competition. Returning soldiers have a challenge representing their skills in the military to civilian audiences. So BadgeWorks for Vets, their project was working with, I believe with graduate students to help them translate those skills into language that civilians would understand and put that as the evidence in the digital badges. So that's one example. I met last week with an organization who's been in close contact with my university, who provides leadership training for the military. And they're very interested in pursuing badges as a potential way of recognizing the competencies that they're offering at an institute in Virginia.
And what about the Boy Scouts?
Well, I don't know about the Boy Scouts, but the Girl Scouts, in fact, were also one of the 30 awardees. The Girl Scouts were, and this is a good example of what's happening around badges. They had a new robotics, no, I'm sorry, not robotics, it was, My Sash is an app is the name of it. So it was they wanted to bring in an innovative curriculum, right? They'd never been doing that before. So they decided that was a good opportunity to bring in this web-enabled credential as well. So that's a good example of the kind of innovation. You wouldn't think just a different way of recognizing, but there's something about badges that seems to spawn that kind of innovation.
Well, I am interested in this because it seems, I like the idea of getting more information, right? I mean, more information is generally better than less information. But I guess I keep coming back to the issue of what's the quality of the information?
Yeah.
Like, what if the information's not so great? Or it's like the old joke about there's lots of bad food.
Yeah.
Okay, so what?
Well, that is the discussion. That's where I was just at the American Educational Research Association conference, and we did a symposium, and we had some research papers, and that topic comes up a lot. Carla Casilli at the Mozilla, now at the Badge Alliance, really about a year ago now, she put up a blog post and she argued that the traditional things that people like me are trained in validity, you've got your consequential criterion, right? Well, she argued and she convinced me that credibility is going to trump validity. What that means is that in the internet, information sort of takes on a life of its own. So there are scholars who study this. It's how does information become credible on the web, right? Some stuff becomes unbelievable or disbelieved overnight. You know, all of a sudden somebody's credibility is crushed by information that circulates very quickly. So that's a big chunk of it is that because it's transparent, it's in these social networks, it's going to be different. Now, if we also solve this problem of the formal really being able to verify badges and really absolutely rock solid no, those together, that actually is going to be a really interesting thing to see. So if the value of these web-enabled credentials is basically being constructed by everybody who's in a social network, by peers, and you have institutional credibility coming in, that's going to change things in ways that it's going to be interesting to see. I don't know exactly how it's going to change it, but I'm pretty sure it's going to change it.
Well, one could argue that's a negative thing in some ways, because then you've got the masses, as it were, voting with their feet. Now, of course, that's democracy,
Yeah.
but on the other hand, it's not Professor Jones or Smith
Yeah.
from high on the mountain coming down
Yeah.
and saying this is good and this is not good.
Yeah, and that's why I don't think that badges will ever replace the formal credential system. I think that will remain. There's a huge institution around there. I think its potential to complement and to add value to it. So if you have your credential, you have your transcript, but you also want to make it possible for people to have a better, a more fine-grained, a transcript. So I've been the chair of a recruiting committee for a long time. I've been looking at applications and interviewing applicants through graduate school for a decade, and it makes me sympathize with recruiters and stuff, because you just don't know. It's really, really hard to know from interviewing, from talking to people. All of that additional information that should be available once this becomes more widespread, I think it will be helpful. It's hard for me to see how it won't be, but there are definitely people who don't see it that way, who worry a lot about sort of crowdsourcing and misinformation being disseminated in networks.
What about younger students? I mean, really younger students. We're talking 10 years old.
Well, there's a huge issue with that, and that's COPPA, the Children's Online Protection Act. Because right now, the thing that makes a badge, that associates a badge with a person, is an email address. Depending on how you read the law, you can't really issue badges to children under 13 because of that. Many of or you can't issue them publicly. I'm not that up on these areas. Several of my colleagues study it quite a bit, but many of the organizations that we're working with, they will have two separate badges. They will have badges for the children, and those never enter they never leave the website of the organization. Once you turn 13, then you can share your badge out over social networks, because you're able to do that. You have to be 13 under the Children's Online Privacy and Protection Act.
Interesting. And what about people who are much older, like people who are retirees?
I'm guessing we won't see too much with that. I think we'll probably see it the way we see social networking with retirees. Some of them take it up, and it's funny, it's curious and stuff. But I do think, in another 10 years, when even people who are retiring, at a time when Facebook and social networking is ubiquitous, I think we'll see some of it. I haven't given it much thought, though.
Well, that's my job as a host,
Okay.
to ask those questions. All right, we've only got a few minutes.
Okay.
What are some things that you'd like to leave viewers with that perhaps we haven't chatted about today?
Well, be patient. It took 100 years for the current credentialing system to get in place. These ideas came together around 2010, so it's really only 4 years in. So if you think about how long it took the traditional credentialing system, we've come quite a long ways. And generally, more information is better than less information, and that's why we're so excited about this. And probably the final thing is that what we've seen in this study, and my project we're wrapping up, my team and I have studied these 30 projects that were funded. What was the most remarkable thing of all is how transformative the process of deciding what claims and what evidence you're going to put in a digital badge. Many organizations, many learning organizations, actually haven't thought about that very much. So you really have to stop and think. Some of the organizations brought in young people who were going to earn them to discuss with them what evidence they would put in and how they would assess that evidence. And they discovered that because of the social nature of those badges, that young people were saying really felt much more strongly about the process than they would otherwise once they start pushing those badges out. And then probably my final thing is to say to skeptics, among educators who would think, why would I ever do this? Well, the act of going through the process yourself, as I've done several times now, you really realize this is different. This is a lot different than anything we've done before, and that it's mostly a pretty good thing. It's a hard thing to make those decisions, but generally speaking, it's a really good thing for educational programs to go through that process.
And for a dean or a president who's watching the show today who's saying, well, this is going to cost a ton of money, how would you respond to that?
That's a really good question. If you did a top-down, if you did a big, expensive top-down rollout, yeah, you could spend a lot, you could dedicate a lot of staff hours to it. But if you opened up the space of innovation, as my university has done, I mean, when I got started, they said, go ahead, do whatever. We might tell you you can't do that, but you won't get in trouble. And they just turned me loose. And so that didn't cost them anything, all that innovation, and it's taken root. We've made a lot of progress. If they allow that to happen, it won't cost them anything.
Well, I think that's a magic number for a lot of people watching this, and so thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you, Steve.
If you would like additional information about Professor Dan Hickey, please visit remediatingassessment.blogspot.com. If you have comments or suggestions about higher education today, please send an email to our viewer mailbox at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. Thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. Please join me again for another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.